So once you find a conference, you need to apply to be a part of that conference. And there's usually several things you have to do. But one thing you have to do, first of all, is just to carefully read the application instructions. You want to be very careful to make sure you provide all the information and to meet any deadlines that they have. Now, there's different ways a lot of times, and each conference will have different instructions. For example, at the American Academy of Religion, you are asked to usually, not all the time, but for the most part, you're asked to just send in an individual paper. And you submit it to a certain program group. So, for example, there's a group on Korean religion, there's also a group on religion and violence, and I might submit to either one of those groups. And in the American Academy of Religion, you're allowed to submit up to 2 papers. Okay, so you do that in that way. So that's one way. In the Association for Asian Studies, though, you can send in individual papers, but they prefer panels. A panel is a group of papers, a group of presenters presenting on a shared theme. So, for example, you have to put together a panel. Together, some colleagues and I are putting together a panel on gender and Catholicism in East Asia. That's an example of a theme. And that was for the Association for Asian Studies, and it was accepted. So to put together the panel, I was the panel organizer. That means that, now this doesn't always happen, but I'm serving as the panel organizer. I put together the panel. I'm also acting as chair. My job as chair is to introduce the panelists and to tell them when they're supposed to be done and to end the presentations and so forth. So, for example, my job is to tell them, okay, you only have 15 minutes to present, and then to remind them when they're getting close to that, and when it's 15 minutes to tell them, okay, we're done. And then it's also my job during the question and answer period to call on people and have them ask their questions and so forth. Then we have the presenters, and we're going to be having 4 presenters, and each one of them presents on something. So, and then we have a person called a discussant, and his job is to respond to those papers, to identify related themes in those papers, and to give a short response, usually about 10 or 15 minutes. And then at that point, we open up the floor to questions. But the key thing here is that's very different, right? This isn't putting together a single paper. I had to organize several papers into a coherent panel with a specific theme. So that's a little different. And so you want to make sure that you have all these groups. If you're asked to provide a chair, you need to provide a chair. If they don't need you to have a chair, you don't need to do that. Now, one thing pretty much though all conferences will require is that you have an abstract. That's how you apply. And usually an abstract is between 200 and 250 words. And it's a short description of what you're going to be doing in your presentation. And if you do a panel, a lot of times you need all the individual abstracts and a panel abstract. So you want to make sure that you do that, or you need to write an abstract, and you need to write a good one. And you want to make sure that if it says 200 words, that it's only 200 words. Sometimes when you send it in, they actually have a computer program that you'll use to submit it, and it will automatically cut you off after 200 words. It won't even let you submit it. So you can't say, oh, it says 200 words, but I only have 205, so it's okay. You want to be careful about that. It's also important to check your English and have other people do so too. You want to just make sure that to maximize your chances of being accepted, for your presentation being accepted, you want to make sure that the English is as perfect as can be. Because the assumption is that if you can't write well in English, you won't be able to speak well in English either. And if the language of the presentation is in English, or language of the conference is in English, then they won't accept you. Now, I'm assuming, of course, the language is in English. It could be in other languages as well. Whatever language it is in, you want to make sure that your writing is clear, easy to understand, and free of mistakes. One thing you also want to be sure to check about is that sometimes funding is available, and sometimes it's not available. I've applied to conferences where they provided everything. They gave us a flight, they gave us a hotel, they gave us food, they gave us everything. I've been to other conferences where I had to pay my flight, but they would give us a hotel. And some conferences won't give you anything. Other conferences will have certain rules for different people depending on what countries they're from. For example, in the Association for Asian Studies, if you're from a country that is a developing country, they will sometimes give you some money to help you to travel. So for example, if you're from the Philippines or Malaysia, they might be willing to give you some money. Similarly, in the Association for Asian Studies, you can actually get money if you're a graduate student. If you're a graduate student and you tell them that you're a graduate student and bring your ID, they will give you a check. Usually they'll give you a couple $100s. So you want to make sure, this is one reason you read all these things carefully, because if you want to make sure that if you can get funding, you get it. So preparing for the conference. One thing that you have to do that people don't like to do, but it is very important, is to write your paper. And usually, if you're going to have 15, 20 minutes to present, you want to make sure to discuss, find out how long you have to present. You want to have, and that's about a paper of about 2,000 to 2,500 words. And you have to write your paper usually because the chair of your panel will want to read the paper beforehand, so he or she can prepare their comments before the conference begins. Now, you also, before you submit your paper, you want to check and recheck it to make sure everything is okay, particularly to make sure that the written English or whatever language it is okay. Now, but at the same time, you don't want to be a perfectionist. What I mean by that is that you want to make sure to write the best paper you can, but you also have to provide it to the chair in a timely manner. The chair has to be given the paper early enough so that he or she can read about it. And I just want to stress, this is one thing. If you want to have a good colleague, be a good colleague, and you want to be part of a scholarly network, you have to respect deadlines. You have to make sure that if you're told to turn in a paper by a certain time, that you make sure that paper is turned in on time. If you do that, if you turn in things on time, you'll be a good colleague. People will invite you to be on panels and to conferences and so forth. If you don't do that, though, people will realize they can't depend on you. Right? We can't depend on someone who doesn't keep deadlines. So you want to make sure you do that. Now, when you actually go to the conference, one thing you have to determine is how you're going to present your paper. You can read your paper. You can just get up and read your paper. And the first time I presented, that's what I did. And if that's not necessarily the most exciting. It's sometimes a little boring to watch someone read a paper. But if that gives the information that needs to be given, that's fine. If that's what you need to do, then go ahead and do it. Especially if you're not confident in your language abilities, that's a good way to go, is just to get up and read the paper. Some people just use PowerPoint, and that's what I do. I just practice my PowerPoint a few times, and then I just get up and use PowerPoint when I present. That's just what I'm most comfortable with. Or you can use both. Sometimes people use a mixture of both. You want to make sure, though, that you know what sort of technology is going to be available. Sometimes there won't be any technology available. Sometimes there will be a projector. Sometimes you will have to bring your own computer if you want to use PowerPoint. Sometimes you won't. And this is something to make sure of as you prepare to go there. And sometimes you have to request from the conference. This is why you have to read the instructions very carefully. Now, one thing you also want to do, especially if it's your first time to present, is to practice several times before you actually present at the conference. You want to present it several times just as practice. And you do this for several reasons. One is just to do the best you can, right? If you've practiced it you're going to be nervous, right? When you give your presentation at the conference, particularly if it's the first presentation, you're going to be nervous. And that's natural. The way to kind of get over that nervousness is to practice it so many times that you'll be relaxed when the time comes. Another important, and it helps to have people observe you because they may notice that you have some difficulties you might be having. For example, when you're nervous, you may walk around a lot or you may move your arms a lot, and that's not good for a presentation, and they'll see that and say, hey, don't do that. Or you may say a lot. That's in English. For English speakers, we sometimes tend to do that. We say and it sounds bad if we say it all the time. In addition, you want to make sure that you're fine on time. You don't want to go over time. If you have 15 minutes, make sure you can present in 15 minutes or less. People do not like it if you go over time because that means that they will lose their time. Right? That happened to a friend of mine where the person before him took too long to present his paper, and then my friend didn't have his full time. And that was really unfortunate. I've also seen people who will come to a conference and try and read a 40-page paper. You don't have time to do that. So they came all this way, they spent all this money and all this time to present at a conference, and they didn't get to present their paper completely because their paper was too long. So you want to be really strict about that. Conferences, there's only a certain amount of time allotted for each paper, so you have to make sure you do that. And if you prepare well, things will go well when you have your presentation. Now, there's certain things to think about when you're traveling to the conference. One thing to think about is what hotel will you stay at if you're at the conference. Sometimes a conference is very close. For example, I sometimes present at the South Carolina Historical Association conference. That conference is only an hour and a half from me, so I don't need a hotel. I just drive there in the morning, drive back at night. However, at the AAS conference I'm going to go to, it's in it's in Philadelphia. That's too far away, so I need a hotel. So there's a couple options for me. One is to stay at a hotel, the headquarters hotel. A lot of times a conference will have a headquarters hotel, and those are really convenient because the headquarters hotel is usually the place where the conference is at. So what I mean by that is that you won't have to actually leave the hotel building to go to the conference. The conference is in the building. And especially if sometimes you'll have job interviews at conferences, and that's very, very convenient if you're going to have a job interview. However, the problem is you oftentimes have to pay extra to stay at the headquarters hotel. Sometimes there's hotels that are nearby that are cheaper. And that can be a good deal too. You can stay at one of those nearby hotels, especially if it's a safe city. You want to make sure the city's safe, and it's in walking distance. If you can save $100 a night by staying at a hotel that's just across the street, that's a good deal, and that's maybe something you should consider doing. So you want to do a little research to see which is the better one to do. Another thing to look into is the rules of the hotel. For example, some hotels will allow you to make a reservation and cancel the reservation without penalty 3 days before the reservation, before you're supposed to stay there. So that's something to make sure of. Other hotels will give you 24 hours, some will give you 72 hours. Sometimes hotels will allow you to have a discount if you go ahead and purchase your hotel right away, but then you can't cancel. And then, so if you don't go, then you lose all your money. So those things are tricky, but you just want to make sure you read the hotel policies. Now, one thing I do whenever I can is to have a roommate. And this is, again, where it helps to have a good scholarly network. So at this, I'm going to be the conference headquarter hotel is a little expensive, the one in Philadelphia that I'm going to. However, one of my colleagues is willing to share a room with me. So he and I will split a room, and that will cut our cost in half. And so that's something to think about. Another issue you have to think about is travel arrangements. How are you going to get to the hotel? How are you going to get to the conference? Are you going to fly or are you going to drive? And sometimes you can save money by driving. Sometimes it's cheaper to fly. And one thing you have to check is the airport. Sometimes there'll be different airports around you that are cheaper. So for example, if I fly out of Greenville Spartanburg, I often have to make a connecting flight, and that costs me extra. However, if I drive an extra hour and a half way to Charlotte, I can just fly directly, and it ends up being cheaper. One thing you also want to be very careful about is what travel documents are necessary when you leave. Is there a passport requirement? Is there a visa requirement? Once, and this is a very sad story, I had organized a panel, and a good friend of mine was going to be our chair. He called me, and the conference was in Canada. And he called me the day before and said, "I'm sorry, Frank, I forgot that I need a passport to go to Canada, and mine's expired." So he wasn't able to come. It was really sad. And so you want to make sure, and that's something that could easily happen to anyone, you want to make sure that you have all your travel documents and they're all up to date.